I mentioned in the last video that I wasn't able to make a section on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because it's so complex it requires its own video. So let's now explore the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Hi, I'm Hugo and I love researching into extraordinary topics. Just like in the last video, I'd like to note that I won't be taking sides in this ongoing conflict, but would rather be stating the facts as well as the views of both sides of the conflict. First, I would like to talk about the British Mandate and the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Palestine was one of many former Ottoman territories which were put under British control after World War I. For example, a United Nations website titled "The Question of Palestine" states that these territories were established under British rule under the League of Nations in 1922. Furthermore, all of these territories eventually became fully independent states, except Palestine, where in addition to the rendering of administrative assistance and advice, the British Mandate incorporated the Balfour Declaration of 1917, expressing support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. In this, during the Mandate, from 1922 to 1947, large-scale Jewish immigration, mainly from Eastern Europe, took place, the numbers swelling in the 1930s with the Nazi persecution. Arab demands for independence and resistance to immigration led to a rebellion in 1937, followed by continuing terrorism and violence from both sides. Although Britain considered many formulas to bring independence to the region, in 1947, the UK turned the Palestinian problem over to the UN. Therefore, Palestine was one of the many territories under British control where all the other territories, except Palestine, became independent, where the Balfour Declaration of 1917 expressed support for a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Furthermore, the large-scale Jewish immigration from 1922 to 1947, along with the formation of the State of Israel, led to a rebellion in 1937, as well as terrorism and violence in the region. As such, even though Britain considered many options to bring independence to the region, they turned the problem over to the UN in 1947. The UN attempted to address the conflict in the region through the two-state solution. For instance, the UN proposed terminating the mandate and partitioning Palestine into two independent states, one Palestinian Arab and the other Jewish, with Jerusalem internationalized, where one of the two envisaged states proclaimed its independence as Israel, and in the 1948 war involving neighboring Arab states expanded to 77% of the territory of Mandate Palestine, including the larger part of Jerusalem. In this, over half of the Palestinian Arab population fled or were expelled during this period. This leads me to discussing the many conflicts which occurred in the region. For example, even though Jordan and Egypt was given the rest of the territory given by Resolution 181, in the 1967 war, Israel occupied these territories, Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which was subsequently annexed by Israel. Furthermore, the war brought a second exodus of about 500,000 Palestinians, where the Security Council in Resolution 242 formulated the principles of a just and lasting peace, including an Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in the conflict, a just settlement of the refugee problem, and the termination of all claims or states of belligerency. The 1973 hostilities were followed by Security Council Resolution 338, where inter alia called for peace negotiations between the parties concerned. Likewise, in 1974, the General Assembly reaffirmed the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, national independence, sovereignty, and to return. Following the wars came the uprisings, also known as intifadas in the region. The first intifada occurred after Israel invaded Lebanon, intending to destroy the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO. There, a ceasefire was arranged where PLO forces withdrew from Lebanon and were redirected to neighboring countries. However, despite the guarantees of safety for Palestinian refugees left behind, a large-scale massacre took place in the Sabra and Shatila camps. Furthermore, in September 1983, the International Conference on the Question of Palestine adopted the following principles: the need to oppose Israeli settlements and Israeli actions to change the status of Jerusalem, the right of all states in the region to exist within secure and internationally recognized boundaries, and the attainment of the legitimate inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. However, in 1987, a mass uprising against Israeli occupation occurred in the occupied Palestinian territory, where methods used by the Israeli forces resulted in mass injuries and heavy loss of life among the civilian Palestinian population. The second intifada occurred in the year 2000 after a visit to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem by the Israeli general and politician Ariel Sharon of the Likud, a right-wing Israeli political party coalition. This led to Israel constructing a West Bank separation wall, which, even though located mostly within the occupied Palestinian territory, was ruled illegally by the International Court of Justice. Since there are a lot of details related to the conflict in the region, and that I have so little time to cover this, if you'd like to learn more, I'd like to suggest going to the UN website listed in the description below. However, to get the point straight, Israel and Palestine have had multiple wars and conflicts in the region from the 1967 Six-Day War to the two intifadas after it. Now, I am going to be exploring both sides of the conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is deeply ingrained into Israeli society. For example, a paper from Harvard University titled "A Game Theoretic Approach to the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict" says on page 46, "The dominant narrative in Israeli society characterizes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a struggle between ethical, restrained Israelis and immoral, deprived Palestinians. As such, cooperating with or offering concessions to Palestinians is tantamount to national betrayal, formalized in the norm enforcement model as defection. Such defections are curtailed by robust social and political norms, themselves upheld by social ostracism, political attacks, and vigilante justice, and analogous to punishment in the norm enforcement model." This means Israel's society mostly views the conflict on a moral level, where they believe anything but compromising with Palestine is justified. The conflict is also deeply ingrained into Palestinian society. For instance, the same paper from Harvard University says on page 48, the dominant Palestinian narrative of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict characterizes Palestinians as an innocent, moral people maliciously and violently uprooted from their homeland by Zionist colonizers. As such, cooperating or even sympathizing with the Israelis is tantamount to national betrayal, formalized in the norm enforcement model as defection. Such defections are curtailed by robust social norms, themselves upheld by social ostracism, vigilante justice, and show trials, all analogous to punishment in the norm enforcement model. Which means that Palestinian society also generally believes that cooperating with Israel is detrimental to them. So to recap, I talked about the British Mandate and the Balfour Declaration of 1917, where Palestine was one of the many territories under British control, where everything else but Palestine became independent, where the Balfour Declaration expressed support for a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. In this, large-scale Jewish immigration from 1922 to 1947, along with the creation of the State of Israel, led to a rebellion in 1937, as well as terrorism and violence in the region. Thus, even though Britain considered many options to bring independence to the region, they turned the problem over to the UN in 1947. The UN attempted to address the conflict for proposing to terminate the mandate and divide Palestine up into two independent states, Palestine and Israel, with its two-state solution, where Israel declared its independence and expanded into the majority of Palestine during the 1948 war, which led to over half of the Palestinian Arab population fleeing or being expelled from their homes during this period. There were many conflicts in the region, such as the 1967 war, where Israel occupied the Gaza Strip and West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as the 1973 hostilities, which was followed by the UN Security Council Resolution 338, which called for peace negotiations between the parties concerned. Likewise, there were many uprisings in the region, such as the First and Second Intifadas, with the First Intifada occurring in 1987, while the Second Intifada occurred in 2000. I finally explored both sides of the conflict, where Israeli society mostly views the conflict on a moral level, where they believe anything but compromising is justifiable, while Palestinian society also generally believes that cooperating with Israel is detrimental to them. Anyways, thank you for watching my video, and merci et à bientôt.